Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on meeting China's climate goals, which we are co-hosting with the Sabin Center for Climate Change at the law school here at Columbia. Our topic today is both timely and hugely important. Tomorrow, President Xi Jinping arrives in the United States for a visit that will include stops in Seattle, Washington, D.C., and New York. And among the most important issues on his agenda will be climate change. And today we have brought together really a remarkable panel of the leading experts in this country on exactly that topic to talk about what China is doing to address climate change and what that means for the world. So we're delighted to be hosting this. I want to thank the generous financial support of the David Sive Memorial Fund, who helped us pull this program together, and thank Mike Gerard, who's sitting right here from the law school. Thank you so much for your help. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce our great speakers, but before I do that, let me just tell you about some of the programs we have coming up here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Under the leadership of our founding director, Jason Bordoff, we have another several months of really very remarkable programs on energy and climate here in New York. A week from today, Monday, September 28th, we are hosting the Right Honourable Amber Rudd, the UK Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, for remarks on UK energy and climate change policy. The same day, we are co-hosting an event with the New York Energy Forum on Iran post-sanctions with our fellow Richard Nephew speaking. On October 6th at 3 p.m. in the International Affairs Building, we're co-hosting a panel on the future of Arctic energy. It's a timely and hugely important topic. The U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council and President Obama's recent trip to the Arctic. On October 8th, the Center is going to host a discussion on the role of international sanctions in the crisis in Ukraine, co-hosted with the Harriman Institute. On October 13th, if you are in London, please join us for a discussion on the geopolitics of energy trade with U.S. Special Envoy for Energy, Amos Hochstein, and many others. And then we will have more events in the months ahead. I want to recognize our Joan Kaufman, is she here, who is the director of our Beijing office, who happens to be here in New York. Joan, thank you for all your work you do in Beijing. It really makes a difference for us in all our work that we do in China. So thank you for all your support. And let me mention also, for those of you who are especially interested in this topic, two of our speakers have agreed to stay around after this public event and have a private roundtable. And we're going to have a private roundtable from 2:30 to 4, where we're going to dig into some of these issues even more deeply. And it is one floor up, I believe, in room 1754. And you're welcome to come if you would like to spend a while digging into this in a kind of private setting. For those of you who are listening on the web and watching the live stream, you can ask questions. Use our hashtag. Or follow us, our hashtag, there it is, CGEP events, hashtag CGEP events, or tweet us at Columbia U Energy with your questions. So for that, with that, let me just briefly tee up this issue for all of us, and then I'm going to introduce our great speakers. I will give brief remarks, and our speakers will dive into this in more detail. I'm going to cover three brief topics in my introductory remarks and go over them at a pretty high level of generality, but I want to frame the discussion. And first talk about Chinese emissions, second talk about China's climate policy architecture, and then U.S.-China climate cooperation. Starting with China's emissions, it's a basic fact. China's emissions are the largest in the world. They are roughly equal to the emissions of the U.S. and the European Union combined. One thing we will be talking about today is there is a fair amount of uncertainty and even some controversy about the exact amount of China's emissions. So don't take that 11 gigatons at the top as a precise number. But ballpark, I don't think there's a question. One of our speakers can say if they disagree with this. I don't think there's a question that China has the largest emissions in the world and roughly the size of the US and the EU combined. For many years, the United States was the world's leading emitter. This, along the x-axis, you see years there, and around 2000, Chinese emissions started accelerating dramatically, and China is now, as I said, the world's leading emitter by far. I thought it'd be useful to compare this to the GDP growth curve for China. It's roughly the same trajectory. So as China's GDP has accelerated at a remarkable pace, so has its greenhouse gas emissions, which is a pattern we've seen in many places around the world. And it's worth, I think, taking a minute just to step back and note that in the past couple of decades, China has had the most successful anti-poverty program in the history of humanity. It is remarkable what China has done to lift hundreds and hundreds of millions of people from poverty. And I just want to show you a few of my favorite pictures that help to underscore that. My first trip to China was actually summer of 1981. I was an exchange student at Huadong Shifan Dashui in Shanghai. And this is what the Shanghai waterfront looked like that summer. This is what it looks like today. So in my adult lifetime, the Shanghai waterfront has gone from that to that. And that reflects an enormous improvement in the material well-being of the Chinese people. It also requires an enormous amount of energy, as this has shown, and that has led to significant increases in greenhouse gas emissions. This, I'm not exactly sure when this picture is. This is Tiananmen Square, and I would guess it's in the 1970s, maybe the early 1980s. This is a picture of China in the 1990s, and this is China today. This type of transition in the vehicle fleet, which is continuing, has dramatically improved the lives of many people. It also has obviously had significant air pollution impacts. And the combination of smog from vehicles and smog from coal has had very significant impacts on local air pollution and also greenhouse gases. China's coal use is the principal cause of its greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll talk more about this, but China's coal use has been accelerating at about the same rate as its GDP and emissions until last year, according to some studies. There's now some uncertainty around this, but according to some data sources, China for the last year actually saw a decrease in coal consumption for the first time this century. One hugely important point I want to make, having talked about how large China's total CO2 emissions are, or greenhouse gas emissions, China's per capita emissions are much smaller than relative to other countries. Here you see the graph. The United States at 17, Japan at 9.3. The EU and China today have roughly the same per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And another point that's worth highlighting is that the cumulative emissions of China have yet to approach those of the United States, and CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. Let me talk a little bit about the policy architecture that China uses to address climate change. And I like the architecture metaphor because there's a structure of policies that the Chinese leadership has used to address climate change. And first, some economy-wide goals. In a historic announcement last fall when President Barack Obama was in Beijing, the Chinese leadership announced that it would peak emissions by around 2030. One of our speakers, a former White House staffer, was very involved in those discussions. And this is, I think, it is an announcement that caught the attention of the world. It was the first time China had agreed to limit and to reduce its total emissions of greenhouse gases. And a point that the Chinese analysts have made here, I think, is worth repeating, that when the EU reached peak emissions of greenhouse gases, which was in 1992, the GDP per capita in the EU was $30,000. The United States reached peak emissions in 2007, and its GDP per capita was $50,000 at the time. China is pledging to peak emissions around 2030 when its GDP is projected to be around $15,000 per capita. So China is projecting to start reducing emissions at a much different level of development than the US and the EU. Another economy-wide goal that is part of the same agreement is to increase non-fossil fuels to 20% of primary energy, so that's renewable and nuclear power, that should say by 2030. that would require, according to some estimates, almost 900 gigawatts of capacity, which is about almost as much power capacity as we have in the United States today. So it's a very, very significant pledge. China has also, as part of its Copenhagen round of agreements, probably should be on this slide, pledged to reduce, it pledged to reduce its carbon dioxide intensity by 45% from 2005 to 2020. It recently increased that, added 60 to 65% by 2030. There's kind of a blizzard of numbers here that the leadership has used to help guide the economy towards reducing emissions. China has 7 pilot programs underway for emissions trading of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas of carbon dioxide, with several 100 million people under these programs, and a national program set to launch soon. And we're going to hear more detail about this, but this is quickly becoming the largest emissions trading program in the world. China has dramatic policies to reduce coal use, including very strict requirements to reduce coal use in the Beijing area, so-called JJJ area around Beijing, in Pearl River Delta and other parts of China, and has had for years policies to close down small coal and inefficient coal plants. China has very aggressive renewables policies, a goal of 100 gigawatts of solar and 200 gigawatts of wind in the next decade. Half of the nuclear plants in the world, half of the nuclear plants under construction in the world today are in China. China has, I believe, 26 operational nuclear power plants today, with 25 more under construction, and is looking to expand nuclear power significantly. And every nuclear power plant that displaces a coal plant has a very, very significant impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. China is bringing in natural gas both through pipelines and LNG terminals, and looking to increase its domestic production of natural gas with policies to promote shale gas, among others. China has, by the way, the largest shale gas resource in the world. China has for many years had very significant energy efficiency policies. I mean, just the Chinese economy is quite inefficient from a energy usage standpoint. It still has many of the vestiges of an old planned economy, many opportunities for improving energy efficiency and their economy-wide goals. There's appliance efficiency programs, there's industrial efficiency programs, and many more. China has smart cities programs to spread green cities, very, very important. And this is there's so much more detail that can be provided under any of these, but I'm trying to set a good model for my fellow speakers and going quickly so we get to our discussion stage here. And then China has significant policies to reduce HFCs, which are super pollutants, with about 20,000 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide per molecule, and or tens of thousands. And China has agreed in the past year or two to significant new programs to reduce emissions of HFCs. Let me say a word about U.S.-China climate change cooperation, particularly as Xi Jinping arrives tomorrow here. I think it is notable, as somebody who's worked on the National Security Council staff at an earlier stage in my career, whenever a head of state comes to town to meet with our president, the number of issues that need to be dealt with are huge. That includes the economy, economics. It includes military relationships. Also, it includes a wide range of issues. That is certainly true when the Chinese leader comes to town. The number of issues that will be on the agenda and have been on the agenda in recent summits is really remarkable, from North Korea to Iran to currency devaluation to currency management to all kinds of things. Against that backdrop, I think it's particularly striking that the last 2 times President Xi Jinping and President Obama met, the headline announcements were really on climate change. And in the 2013 Sunnyland Summit, there was a significant agreement on HFCs, and then last year, a historic agreement to take up climate change between the 2 countries. The first time that President Obama met with the Chinese leader, with Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping's predecessor, in 2009, there were about 5 major clean energy announcements that were made back in 2009. So this dates back to certainly beginning of President Obama's presidency, and indeed I would add that during the presidency of George W. Bush, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson was a remarkable leader in this area and helped put together a significant dialogue and set of agreements between the two countries on this issue. So this has really been quite bipartisan in this country. One of my favorite programs, because I was involved in it, among other reasons, is the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which is a program between our two countries to work together to promote advanced research in clean coal technology, clean vehicles, building energy efficiency, and recently energy and water has been added to that. I want to include this because I think this may be the happiest slide of two Chinese and two American leaders together that I have ever seen. If anybody knows of a slide with happier officials, let me know. I think by coincidence, the two American officials here actually happen to be of Chinese descent, although neither one of them speaks a word of Mandarin. But on the right there, that's Chinese Minister Wang Gang, then U.S. Ambassador Gary Locke, she's now Vice Premier Liu Yandong, and former Energy Secretary Steve Chu, and this is the signing of the protocol for the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. It's been a very important cooperative program between our two countries. And one reason I think there's enormous potential for our two countries to work together, and just to close, is what we've accomplished here in the United States. I actually think, I can say this as an American, I think my country has done some things very poorly in the last several decades. One thing, however, we have done very well is clean the air in our cities. And it's quite remarkable. This is Los Angeles City Hall in October 1968. It's the same place today. And those of you who are veteran New Yorkers recall the incredibly dirty air in this city 30 years ago. We've done a very good job in cleaning the air, Susan, and I think it gives me great optimism both for the ability of China to clean its local air, address its local air pollution problems, and for our two countries to work together on these issues. So you see a lot of this type of imagery in U.S.-China relations. I believe this is possible, particularly when it comes to working energy and climate change. So thank you. So with that, that's my brief introduction. Let me introduce our really great speakers, and I'll have them come up and talk one-on-one, or one at a time, and then we'll all come up for a discussion among ourselves and then throw it open to all of you. And I'm going to introduce them all at once and then ask them to come up. So first we have Kelly Sims Gallagher, who is currently a professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School and a former senior policy advisor at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, where she was very involved in these issues. Kelly's also the director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Tufts and a senior research associate at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. She's the author of a number of leading books on this topic, which I highly commend to you. Julio is a research associate and the Giorgio Ruffalo Research Fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also a Resnick postdoctoral scholar in applied physics and material sciences at the California Institute of Technology. His research assesses the human impacts on the Earth system in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. He has a PhD in ecology from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And Valerie Karplus is the class of 1943 career development professor and assistant professor of global economics at the Sloan School at MIT, and director of the Tsinghua MIT China Energy and Climate Project. She's an expert on China's energy trends, holds a BS in biochemistry and political science from Yale, and a PhD in engineering systems from MIT. So we really have a remarkable group, and that only began to get at their expertise. Let me start by welcoming Kelly Sims Gallagher to the stage.
All right, well, it's just great to be here. Thanks very much to you, David, and to everyone here at SEPA for inviting me down. Fletcher feels a strong sense of competition with SEPA, so it's a pleasure to come down and check out the competition. I just wanted to begin with a quick disclaimer, which is that my participation and remarks today are in my capacity as a professor at the Fletcher School, and solely in that capacity. So I just wanted to make that clear. So we've got 5 minutes, and I wanted to just, use that 5 minutes to make 3 points on the topic of today's advertised seminar, which is meeting China's climate goals. My first major point is that China has fundamentally altered its approach on climate policy from one being primarily grounded in ideology to one being primarily grounded in pragmatism. When I think back to when I first started working in China, climate change policy was almost entirely thought of as an international phenomenon and in the province of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. China took its role in the context of those negotiations as, being a member of the G77 in China and associating with that bloc. And it's completely different today. Now I would argue Chinese climate policy is inherently bifurcated. China remains committed to the UN Framework Convention process, but in addition to that, it is pursuing a very progressive and pragmatic and concrete program of action in domestic climate policy and other international policy in other international fora, whether that's the US-China joint announcement or other ways of engaging internationally on climate. I don't think that these are inconsistent. I think that, however, China's emphasis now might be slightly on the latter, the bilateral approach, the domestic policy, and other pragmatic steps forward. In terms of the domestic policy, China is doing a very impressive job focusing on development and deployment of clean energy and energy efficiency. And David already spoke about that a little bit, so I'm not going to dwell. I think that they put a very ambitious non-fossil goal in the joint announcement last year. And we're already seeing clear evidence of their ability to be on track to meet that goal. China is expanding its clean energy system faster than any other country in the world. They're using a lot of innovative policies to get that clean energy deployed and increasingly aggressive energy efficiency measures as well. My second major point is that some of you may remember the call for China to become a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder internationally and to shoulder, the mantle of leadership on issues of international import. And I would argue that on this issue, I think China has become a responsible stakeholder. We're seeing increased leadership in the UNFCCC context. There was the bold step to join the United States in the joint announcement last year. And while, of course, to us that seemed entirely sensible, in the Chinese context, given that China had always primarily worked in the context of its coalitions with other developing countries, whether it's the G77 in China or BASIC or the BRICS, this was the first time it reached out and extended a hand to another industrialized country in a serious way to show leadership on the climate change issue. I think through its domestic policy, it is demonstrating a lot of leadership as well for other rapidly emerging developing economies and showing that there is a way to pursue cleaner policies and cleaner energy systems even in the context of challenging circumstances, an economy reliant heavily on coal, a huge population, and trying to alleviate poverty. And then I think most recently, as of last week, we saw great evidence of this at the subnational level as well with the Climate Leaders Summit. I was out in LA. It was great to see those two pictures. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, 12 Chinese mayors and 12 American mayors and governors joined together to sign a climate compact and to show their leadership and make new commitments on climate change. And to me, it was extremely exciting that on the Chinese side, they formed a new association called the Peking Pioneers Association. And these mayors have all agreed to achieve earlier peak years in their greenhouse gas emissions from the national target, and in some cases, much earlier. So Beijing and Guangzhou, two of the largest cities in China, committed to a 2020 peak year, a full 10 years ahead of the national peak. And that is very exciting. It means that this quality of leadership is occurring at not just the central government level, but also at the subnational level in China. And by the way, the US mayors were great too. One mayor from Lancaster, California, has committed to net zero emissions next year in his city, which is amazing and very exciting. So there, I urge you to look at the fact sheet and see all of these extremely progressive commitments. It made me very optimistic about our ability to tackle this problem. So then my third point really is, what should we be focusing on post-Paris? I don't want to take for granted that we're going to have a successful international climate agreement, but I do feel quite optimistic about it. So I'm already looking past and assuming we get a good agreement in Paris. What are the next steps? And I'd say there's two big areas of work before us. The first is on domestic policy. And here I think some innovation will be needed in China, notwithstanding all the great progress that I think that China has already made in this space. I do think that they need to move past their traditional approach of having national targets and then decomposing the targets to the provincial level and then decomposing those targets to the municipal level and then down to the township level, and then trying to hold those local officials accountable. This is hard. And the Chinese leadership will say it's hard. It's a hard way to run policy. So notwithstanding this great leadership that we're seeing at the subnational level, I think that there's an argument to be made for an enhanced regulatory approach in China, but that would require innovations in China's policy architecture for enforcement. And I also think there's room for more experimentation with price instruments, and that would, in turn, probably require innovation in the tax system in China, just like it would here. And then the third thing in this category, where I think China is really behind, is resilience. It's inevitable that every country will experience and is already experiencing the impacts of climate change. We hope to slow them down as much as possible through mitigation. We hope to avoid and prevent as much as possible. But there's a vulnerability to China's own population and to countries around the world. And I think China could step up in that space. The second main focus for the post-Paris agenda, I think, is on finance. One area where both the United States and China have a lot of leadership potential is in overseas development finance and greening it, making it more climate resilient and focusing more on mitigation. And of course in our own domestic portfolios as well. And I think this is kind of the next frontier. The overall sums for overseas development finance dwarf whatever we're going to get in the Green Climate Fund. And we really need to work on kind of mainstreaming climate change into these overall funds. So let me just stop there. I don't want to go on too long, and I look forward to the Q&A.
That was great, Kelly. Thank you very much. I'm now honored to welcome Julio to the stage.
Thank you, David, and thank you, our wonderful host in Columbia University, to give me this wonderful opportunity to share with my ideas to our wonderful audience. And what I'm talking today, what I want to share with you today is some of my recent researches that can give you some very basic idea with basic notes about what's the situation we have. And as you can see that here is a, points, here is a trends of the carbon emission from the major countries like China and the US and India. And the one thing I want to say is that you can see that in 2007, this is the year which I start to look at the carbon emission in China. And you can see it's just China just passed US in 2007. And now China's carbon emission is about twice as much as US. And if we look at the emission in 1 year, like how much of the emission in 2013 compared with 2012, if you look at the emission growth in just a single year, you can see that actually the total increment of the emission, 80% of such emission is actually located to country in China. So this means if we allocate the mitigation responsibility to individual country, how should we allocate this? Should we allocate like 80% in China? This is a really very big question, and if we want to really stop the global warming, we want to really do some benefit in our environment. That means that China will contribute a lot. So some of my recent publications have a very simple calculation about what China should do when it wants to peak the carbon emission by 2030. I think my colleague Valerie also did a lot of work on modeling. It's just a very basic modeling work to show that here is the basic BAU scenario. If we don't do anything, we don't do any like mitigation, we don't do anything like energy conservation, what's China's emission will keep growing, and it will grow very fast. And if we want to peak the carbon emission by 2030, how much of the emission will be reduced? You could see that I have a triangular show the total emission that should reduce if we want to reduce the emission by 2030. And how much it will be? It will be about like 30 gigaton of carbon of the carbon emissions. This amount is equal to today's annual total emission in the whole world, which means we will cut the amount of the whole world emission for a year, like in the single country in China. How to achieve this is a very big issue. It's a very big challenge here. And several experience, China has a very good experience by using the command and control policy. China has a very strong administrative measures. They do this very successful when in the previous year we control our energy efficiency, we control our energy consumption, and especially China uses these measures to close the low efficient factories, to close the small companies, the companies that use the low technology has been directly shut down. Like we call it the kind of how to say this in English? I can say, yeah, it's kind of to shut down all of the low efficient factories. And in the contrast, U.S. has a very good experience in using the market measures to control the air pollution and to improve the efficiency of the energy system. This is what China can be learned from U.S. Very importantly, China start to use some kind of market measurements to control the total emission. So we have a pilot project on right now is seven places to build up the market, to build up the Cape trade markets. And they would still need a lot of emission mitigation amounts that come from the technology innovation, from different technologies. But this is still a very big challenge. The situation is, if we look at the whole manufacturing system for the whole world, this is very fresh research that will come out next month, but I will show here. It's basically we calculate the emission that embodied in trade. which means if we look at the international trade, we look at the goods and cargoes that maybe sell from US and finally consumed in China, or sell like produced in China, maybe consumed in Japan or somewhere. We look at how much of the emissions that are associated with this product. If you buy an iPhone, the emission actually produced in the production side, you don't produce any emission when you use it. But your activity as a consumer, they directly introduce such kind of carbon emission. So this kind of a consumption-based accounting tell you where the emission source come from. We look at the emission embodied trade, you could see that China and the US are the top countries. This list include more than 150 countries, and just list the top 25. And you can see that who is the country that imports most of the cargoes, most of the embodied emissions is US. And who's the country that produces the most? This is China. And one of the importance is what's the economic values when you produce such emission. For example, we could see a lot of emissions that actually produced in China because those cargoes, those products are being consumed in US. And some part of the cargoes and goods are also produced in US but also consumed in China. But here the intensity, which valued by the emission per unit of GDP, indicates that actually China is a country that least worse in the world, that China have the highest emission intensity, which means China produced a lot of emission by just get very little added value during the international trade. How this situation can be solved? What's the reasons of such a situation? This is because China have a very cheap labor cost. It have an advantage when compared with the comparative advantages in the whole economy. So if there is a manufacturing, the manufacturing should be located in China. But if they locate in China because of technology, because of a lot of the coal used in China, that means that China will produce more emission when same product has been produced in any else in the world. So you can see that actually lots of the emission in China is because the consumed around the world. To solve this question, we'll not just will not only depend on we develop our technology, but also require us to change our lifestyle. Here is another research I'm in preparation that to show that if we calculate the individual, each people's carbon footprint, like what we live, what we use of cars, what we use the house, what's the carbon footprint of a house, of our food. And we can see they have a very huge gap, very, very huge gap between the developing country and the developed countries, which means that if every developing country like China, like India, or even maybe Africa countries, they want to live as same level as the developed country, the whole world crushed. This is no excuse, no any kind of a doubt about this result. Here is a group of different kind of income group of China, different Chinese people. They have if we grouped with Chinese people live in the rural area and live in the urban area, we can find that the richest Chinese people, the carbon footprint of richest Chinese people is already equal to the sum of the developed countries. But most of the Chinese people, like this is 85% of the total population, they're still very low. So they give us a hint that if we really want to change this situation, we will not only need to have that different measures. They need a revolution in our lifestyle. We cannot live as currently as we lived in developed country. We need a new way for that. So this is just a basic notes for you, and thank you and welcome for the questions.
That was great. Thank you very much, Yu, and I'm delighted to introduce Valerie Karplus, one of the leading experts in the country on these topics. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here and provide to you a brief snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing up at MIT in close collaboration with Tsinghua University in Beijing on these and related, this doesn't look like, here. Start with this. So we have a joint team that connects researchers in China and at MIT on these issues. We've been tackling these issues over the last couple of years, and we'll share with you just some of the insights and also comment briefly on some of the points raised in earlier comments. So this is a very exciting time in U.S.-China climate relations and also in China domestically when it comes to addressing energy and environmental challenges. We have as backdrop for this conversation the China-U.S. climate agreement, which already took place last November and followed on by China's commitment ahead of the Paris meeting at the end of June, which really formalized its commitment to peak emissions by 2030 to raise the share of non-fossil energy to 20% of the total and achieve lasting continued reductions in carbon intensity. So this is the fact that it was announced together with the U.S., I think, is a strong signal that this is indeed an area for cooperation going forward, and it continues to be a real bright spot in the conversation between the two countries. We also see in China, if you've been reading the headlines over the summer, that there are some real challenges on the ground in terms of dealing with industrial overcapacity. Also, the need to address environmental problems has meant that China has emphasized now environmental sustainability challenges more broadly alongside economic growth. And so we're seeing a shift to what is broadly referred to as a new normal. Now, finally, air quality remains an important issue, but we're seeing some progress this year, in part because of the economic challenges, but also, I think, because this is now really an important part of how China is addressing its energy system more holistically, thinking about how can we address climate change and air quality at the same time. So again, there's progress that we're seeing on the eastern coastal cities. The center and western parts of the country still face significant challenges in cleaning up air quality, but I think we're seeing progress and exciting advances here. So this is just a brief picture of what pollution looks like in Beijing over the course of 2014, 365 days. You can see both blue sky days and rather gray, more dismal days. Now, this points to a huge balancing challenge that Beijing faces. How do you move forward human development and industrial modernization at the same time as you address global climate change and local pollution? And this is, I think, something that David pointed to earlier. China will have to do this at a much lower level of per capita income than many other countries have done. Now, this is just a snapshot of China's energy system. I think this just fills out what other presentations have highlighted. Basically, if we look at primary energy, most of that primary energy comes from coal. It's largely used in the industrial sector. So if we think about how China has changed the Asian energy demand profile over the last, let's say, several decades, it's really most of the increase has been due to China, and the increase in emissions has largely been due to coal used in the industrial sector. That's not the whole story, but it's a big part of the story. If we look at the recent numbers, we already see some signs that perhaps this trend is reversing. Now, I think it's in academia, if you based your conclusion on one data point, you would be thrown out with no more questions asked. So I'm putting this up there to give you pause, also to think about, when we talk about peaking, we should, I think, really not think about a single year, even though it's nice to have targets. We should think about a process by which you actually halt the rise of coal or CO2 emissions. And indeed, the trajectory in the US has looked more like a plateau than a sharp Mount Everest-style peak. If we look at electricity demand, we're also seeing a slowdown even from a few years ago. And so in light of these developments, our team actually undertook a China Energy Outlook in 2014. This is earlier than some of the recent economic headwinds, but I think what the logic embodied in this piece of work still rings true in the discussion today. So what we did here was that we were really interested in assessing some of the new directions that were being outlined in China's at that time, the third plenum and a number of announcements around economic reform were just coming out. We were also hearing about the launch of the 7 pilots for emissions trading. Non-fossil energy subsidies were, again, also well established on the scene, but there was discussion of whether to enhance, how to have these fit together with the broader package of energy policies. Energy price reform is now underway, particularly with respect to natural gas, but I think we already see some discussion about electricity price reform. We'll see where that ends up going. And again, we have this new normal economic growth. So to think about how all of these pieces come together, we used the China and Global Energy Model, just developed at Tsinghua and MIT by our joint team. Provides a global model for projecting forward the impact of policies in China as well as other global regions on the economy, energy use, and emissions, with particular focus on the dynamics in the energy-intensive sectors. So what did we, first of all, assume in this model when we thought about a no-policy scenario? We looked at the Chinese government plans for increased improvement in or targets for improving GDP. We see, even in these official plans at that time, growth was expected to slow down, but real GDP, it was, and I think it's still hoped it may grow around 6 times in real terms before 2050. Now, looking at this, I think it's important to realize that this means that the growth rate in China will slow down and even slows down significantly in the 2020 to 2025 timeframe. Importantly, we also build into this modeling effort the structural change that is expected to happen in the Chinese economy as exports play less of a role and consumption plays more of a role. This means significant impacts across the industrial sectors. We also then took 3 policy scenarios, starting with the no policy, the second column from the left, and compared it to the policies on the books at that time, which were established under the Copenhagen approach in 2009, that China was going to would reduce CO2 intensity by 40 to 45% by 2020 relative to 2005 levels. Again, we kept everything else more or less constant as it was then. And in our accelerated effort scenario, which is the far right column, we were interested in what happens if China really takes additional steps to reduce carbon intensity at a faster pace and allows more low-carbon energy, particularly nuclear, to be built on the same time frame. So I won't go into detail on the assumptions in this scenario just for the sake of time, but suffice it to say that this accelerated effort scenario is basically the world we are in today. So if we look at the accelerated effort scenario, the colored stacked graph at the bottom will show you exactly what the energy mix breakdown as it evolves in the accelerated effort accelerated effort scenario looks like. So you see coal peaking at about 2020, gradually declining. Oil continues to play an important role. With carbon pricing, the transportation sector is less affected because it's essentially a more expensive way to reduce CO2 emissions. You may want to reduce petroleum-based fuel use for other reasons, but here you can really see how nuclear continues to grow dramatically. Natural gas use increases. Now we expect maybe it will increase even more given current infrastructure plans. Meanwhile, we see continued growth in wind, solar, and biomass. The dotted line just above it shows you where things were on the energy front under the continued effort, or what China was, where China was essentially in 2011 with its earlier set of commitments. So this is a significant step forward. It also means significantly lower carbon emissions, especially in the longer term. So again, the accelerated effort scenario sees peak emissions in the 2025 to 2035 timeframe. Again, this is not intended to be precise. And then what we have just above it is the trajectory for the continued effort scenario, which shows how the gap evolves. Now, when we think about peak years and amounts, many people want to see this slide. I'm putting it up there for you picophiles, but in terms of exact numbers, these are meant to be illustrative only. So let me just talk very briefly about some of the uncertainties at play here. We have potential for slower economic growth. We have the possibility that China will develop coal to liquids technologies, which could dramatically change how coal is used in the energy system. And finally, we also have a lot of uncertainty surrounding the development of low carbon technology in China and efforts to deploy that technology. So we can't say that this picture is going to come to be. Certainly we would never say we're in the crystal ball business, but we intend to come back and revisit these projections as situations evolve and as we get new insights on the future shape of China's energy system. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all three of you. Those were tremendous presentations. I learned a lot. I didn't expect to learn a new English word, but I did, the picophiles, which is, for those of you who are in this area, it's a very appropriate word. For those of you who are listening on podcast or watching on the web, this is a Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and Columbia Law School joint program on meeting China's climate goals. My name is David Sandalow. I'm here with Julio, Valerie Karplus, and Kelly Sims-Gallagher. And let me just start with a general question about air pollution and climate change. China's local air pollution problems get a lot of attention. And for people who aren't expert in this area, can anybody just comment on the relationship between addressing local air pollution problems of the kind that are so visible and addressing climate change issues? Anybody want to?
I'm happy to take that.
Thank you, Val. This is Professor Valerie Karplus of MIT.
So I think this is really an important nexus to consider, the case of China. Much of the recent action around air pollution and energy system transformation more broadly, I think has given sort of new impetus, new confidence to efforts to sign up to significant carbon commitments globally. So there's a connection between the energy system transformation that China has to achieve for domestic reasons, for health reasons, for environmental reasons, and the longer-term challenge of addressing climate change. However, the steps that you would take to address each of these are not perfectly aligned. And I think it's important in China and everywhere, I think we learned our lesson. Most developed countries cleaned up air pollution without cleaning up carbon. China has an opportunity to do both at the same time. Basically, the place to start is with the initiatives such as energy efficiency, coal reduction that are going to deliver both climate and air pollution benefits, and then moving forward thinking about additional measures outside of energy, such as ammonia control, that will be important in cleaning up local air quality, while at the same time not allowing air pollution efforts, particularly those directed at populous cities, to result in the movement of dirty assets to other places, maybe far from population centers, but those that are still emitting CO2 emissions will not do anything for the climate problem. So we can't just move our emitting facilities outside of cities. This is going to be, I think, one of the biggest challenges that China faces.
Great. Other?
Can you use
Go ahead.
this?
You can keep it on there. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. The climate change is a global issue and air pollution is a local issue. But for China, we can see there is a very straightforward co-benefits in terms of mitigating the climate change and also to mitigate the air pollution to have the benefit of the health in China. Because the air pollution issue and the carbon emission issue are all caused by our fossil-based energy system. 70% of China's energy is supplied by coal, and another 20% is supplied by oil and gas. So basically 90% of China's energy is fossil-based. If we use this energy, we will both introduce a lot of carbon emission and also the PM2.5 and also the SO2 and also NOx. All of these air pollutions, they come from the source of our energy system. So if we find a way to have our renewable energy system, have more clean energy system, we do have a chance to both handle this issue. And we have observed that especially in mega city in Beijing, like in Shanghai, as they implement a lot of technology for clean the boilers, for clean the combustion equipments, they do have we do observe that the air pollution, both the air pollution and the carbon emissions are decreased. So there, I think it's kind of a China's opportunity because without the local air pollution, China will not have so strong, initiative to control the both air pollution and the climate change. But now this is our timing here because we must do this, and we could do this.
Professor Sims-Gallagher, you've written a lot about energy innovation and its role in addressing this issue. And I wonder whether you think that energy innovation is going to play an important role in China's efforts to address climate change in the decades ahead.
Yes, the short answer is yes. I think that China's already in a leadership position. According to analysis some colleagues and I did several years ago now, trying to estimate investments in energy research, development, and demonstration, China came out actually #1 in the world in that analysis. Of course, we were including state-owned enterprise spending at that time, which slightly skewed the investments. But still, I think there's plenty of evidence that China's working very hard on advanced coal technologies, more efficiency technologies, clean vehicle technologies, and they see that as a crucial pathway towards being able to achieve the kind of peaks whenever they occur, and to achieve the economic growth and development outcomes that they like at reasonable cost. And so I do think that energy innovation is essential. I think a lot of people tend to forget that it needs to be coupled with market incentive or market formation policies, and this is the theme of my most recent book on the globalization of clean energy policy. Without the market formation policies, the ones that correct against market externalities like pollution, it's very hard to get new inventions out the door and into the marketplace. So that is crucial for the deployments. They need to go hand in hand and ideally be designed together so they can work together most efficiently.
You mentioned when China peaks. Does anybody have any view about, can China peak its emissions of carbon dioxide earlier than 2030? Any of your view?
Okay. I think the answer is definitely yes. but it depends on basically on the economic activities. If China's economy cannot go very well, can maybe the economic growth slow down, and even the worst situation, the economy may be fluctuated, then there will be, for the emission side, there will be like a good news. China will achieve this target easy than like if they keep the economic growth at 7% per year. But the situation is, whatever China do, they always need to rely on like what we have a lot of manufacturing in China. We have a lot of factories, a lot of workshops here. So we need to have more like high efficient technology. We need to use our market to control the emissions. Whatever the situation is, the effort still need to be done, and this is still a very, very large job.
I think the declaration with the United States says that China will use best efforts, or some equivalent language, I believe, in order to reduce emissions to peak emissions before 2030. So you're optimistic that that can happen. How about, can I put Valerie? Oh, did I mishear you, Julio? Are you optimistic that that can happen?
I'm not consider myself as so optimistic.
Okay. Okay.
I think my research already tell that if China want to peak by 2030, they will cut the total emission as a whole world we have today. So it's kind of a very big task.
Valerie, Kelly, any thoughts?
Go ahead.
I'm optimistic. I think, it is a big task. I mean, we should not underestimate what needs to be done. But if China is able to transition its economy to a more significantly more efficient, a less carbon-intensive place, particularly through the reduction in coal use, and coal is a share of the energy mix. And without, I think when these transitions happen, it's really important, broadly speaking, not to try to hide the ball in the sense that, if, say, China goes for coal to liquids or some of these other conversion technologies in a big way, those emissions need to be counted still. And so I think there is seriousness about counting them in China. So I think my sense is that people are taking this very seriously, and the accounting issues will be critical. However, given our current economic trajectory, given particularly, I think the sustained effort and the ability in China to sustain investments in clean energy, and to work through some of the integration challenges, I think if these can be solved, I'm really optimistic.
Kelly Sims Gallagher.
So let me give a different kind of answer. Same result. I'm also optimistic, but for slightly different reasons, which is that I think that there's a much greater degree of political will in China than I have ever seen before. And that's because the Chinese leadership wants to do this anyway, for different reasons, for different complementary reasons, whether it's addressing the local air pollution issues, which are causing so much political pressure, or whether it's because the Chinese government is determined to reduce the resource intensity of the Chinese economy as an economic development strategy, and to transition to what they see as the 21st century economy that's based on services and lighter industry. All of this is going in the right direction. So, and in addition to that, they believe that they have a responsibility to do this. So for those three big reasons, I do feel quite optimistic.
Great. I want to get to questions from the audience. We have a great crowd here. Before that, I want two questions. First, I want to get to emissions trading in a minute, but first I want to ask Julio a very specific question, because you've published an article in Nature magazine that raises very significant questions about the data with respect to emissions in China. Do you just want to say a word about that and what your argument is in that paper?
Yeah, one of the very critical issues is about what's the situation, what's the baseline of the emission. If we talk about the peak, we talk about what's the future scenario. We always go from what's the data we have. And for the developing country like China, like India, the data connection is very not so comprehensive as developed country, and also most of the emission are consumed, like being produced in maybe just a few years. Like before 5 years, China's emission is just half of this current level. So if we look at this emission, we cannot get very accurate data, especially for the big country like China, India. And one of my recent research, we do a very detailed analysis to look at the individual coal mines to get the coal's emission factor. We found that China's coal actually not good as we thought before, because previously the scientists, they use the coal quality as in US and in EU as a default value for the global average, and they use this global average to assume how much of the emission in China being produced. And we find that more ash in coal, in per unit of the coal. So basically more ash related with less carbon. So the total emission in China actually lower than previously estimated. But this not implies that China can give a break or have a rest in like control mitigate the carbon emission. On the other hand, this implies that we need a very concrete baseline to propose the emission mitigation proposals.
I should note that Julio's very interesting article in Nature has prompted quite a discussion among the experts in this area. And if anybody's interested in this topic in more detail, we're going to have a conversation about this one floor upstairs starting at 2:30 today, along with some other issues. And you're welcome to attend our roundtable on this topic. I just want to ask about emissions trading and then ask for questions from the crowd, because the emissions trading program in China has gotten a fair amount of attention, and it's very large. Any comments about it, and kind of word about how important it is in China's efforts to address climate change? Valerie Karplus.
I'll just make one quick point on this. I think, it's extremely promising to see China experimenting with market-based instruments and on such a large scale. The challenge, I think, points to something that Kelly brought up in her remarks, which is the governance structures and the accountability mechanisms that are in place. So there are huge challenges, first and foremost, to establishing the kind of credible emissions inventories for all enterprises. I think this is why the focus is on large enterprises, where these issues may be easier or have already been resolved. Looking forward, I think what China will need to address is its current system of disaggregating targets at as Kelly mentioned, to the level of provinces, to the level of industries, to individual companies, and having companies take that as sort of the sort of final target or their final responsibility, rather than being willing to engage in trading in order to take advantage of the flexibility that a trading mechanism provides. In interviews in China, I've been amazed at how even individuals within companies have carbon quotas and reduction targets. And I think finding a way to evolve from that system, which has its merits and has worked, in part in previous efforts, to a system that works even better and more effectively and efficiently to reduce emissions will be a critical challenge in squaring the circle when it comes to making emissions trading programs really work on the ground in China.
Great.
David, let me just say one quick thing. I have always been very impressed by how well China experiments with policy, and we have a harder time with that in the United States. I mean, to some extent, we learn at the state level and take lessons from those experiments back to the federal level. But China does it very explicitly and seriously. And so by doing these 7 pilots, I am sure they've learned a lot of lessons. And so we can hope that they'll carry those lessons, when they design their national system. But I do want to say that for it to work well, transparency is going to be critical, because market actors are not going to want to engage in the system unless they're sure that they're buying something real, that they're buying a real emissions reduction when they're making that credit. So I think that's going to be a hard one for China, just based on its experience, and it's something they'll have to focus on intently. But it is certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think if we've learned anything about climate policy, we've tended to put all our hopes on, one policy at a time, whether it's a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, and that the practical reality as we see it around the world is you need a whole suite of different types of policies that are complementary, maybe even sometimes slightly redundant, so that they backstop each other and keep you moving forward.
Great. I believe we have microphones somewhere. There are. And why don't we go to the front row right here? We've got a couple of questions on this side, then we'll come over here. And please identify yourself.
Hi, Nina Gardner, an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins on corporate sustainability, business, and human rights. So I actually just wanted to follow up on the corporate angle, because I know the UN Global Compact has got a pretty robust office going on in Beijing and around China. And if those of you who feel they can comment on sort of what is the buy-in that you're seeing, if you were looking into that, on the state-owned enterprises and just the corporate sector in general in trying to reach these targets.
Buy-in from the Chinese corporate sector. Any thoughts on that?
Just quickly, I think particularly the state-owned enterprises, are supportive, are openly supportive of these efforts on carbon. It means, in some cases, it means a big shift in sort of existing business plans and direction. Nevertheless, I think there's efforts to try to make this possible. State-owned enterprises will play a key role in this transition as well. As well as the private sector. I think it's going to be across the board. Everybody's got a role to play. The government can help this by being very clear about the directions that it hopes to see both, first, a carbon pricing system established, but also when it comes to investment in sort of new energy or clean energy, low carbon energy types, I think there is also an important role for certainty about targets in renewable energy development, because it's not just about getting the price signal right, it's also about creating long-term incentives for innovative activity. And so, I think there is a lot of buy-in. Even where there's pain, there's still support.
And we go front row here and then to Professor Gerard right here.
Frank Kale, alum of the East Asian Institute here. I have an anthropological, sociological question about what motivates the policymakers. For example, is it public health fears because of the effects on the population? Is it the prestige factor of, which counts very much for most Chinese activity? If the rest of the world is making breakthroughs in best practices, we need to do it too. Is it fear of some of the grassroots opposition to the results of past policies with regard to air pollution, river pollution, et cetera?
Great, thank you. So what's the motivation?
What's the motivation?
What's the
Let me
motivation?
say, in addition to the other motivators I mentioned a few minutes ago about the political pressure from air pollution and human health and the desire to transform the Chinese economy, the other one I would add is that cooperation on climate and leadership on climate helps to embody Xi Jinping's, proposal of a new model of great power relations. And this is really indicative of my second point in my remarks, which is that in some areas, I think China's trying now, maybe because of prestige or maybe because of a sense of responsibility, I can't say, to shoulder some responsibility for global issues. And I think we're seeing that on climate, and we're starting to see that in global health with their response to the Ebola crisis as a second example.
Michael Gerard of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Could someone comment on the future of carbon capture and sequestration technology, both in terms of technology development and deployment?
I can. Well, this is on the state-owned enterprise question, I wasn't quite sure how to answer that. But actually, I think on the CCS technology, that's where we've seen some real leadership from state-owned companies in China. So for example, Huaneng, which is one of the largest electricity companies in China, if not the largest, has built the first big global carbon capture and storage for enhanced oil recovery project called the GreenGen project, which somewhat ironically was inspired by the US FutureGen project, which was canceled. So this is a really good example of a Chinese company deciding this is something we need to learn about and understand and start experimenting with, and they went ahead and built a whole huge industrial system to do it, and they've also been at the forefront of leadership on post-combustion capture technology. That being said, I still think there's much more work to be done. In China, the mantra is always utilization, not CCS, but carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is understandable because the costs of carbon capture, utilization, and storage are still too high. And without market incentives, you need to be able to get some economic value out of the CO2. So whether it's using it for enhanced oil recovery, or in the last joint announcement, there was an announcement for an enhanced water recovery project to inject the CO2 to pump up water, saline water that could either be desalinized or used in industrialized processes. You're getting economic value out of it. But there's been very little study in China of actual storage, so injection and permanent storage. And that's something that China's going to have to experiment more with if it actually sees that as a viable long-term solution to reducing emissions from coal.
I see. Right here in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Wentz, and I'm also from the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. So we've been talking a lot about opportunities and things that China is doing right to meet its emissions targets. And I'm curious about barriers and whether there's anything that China is currently doing wrong to meet these emissions targets. And you mentioned the decentralized regulatory system being a barrier, and also the need for accountability and transparency and enforcement capacity. But I'm curious if there's any specific policies or regulations in place right now that might impede their progress towards the targets, such as fossil fuel subsidies, or maybe a lack of regulations for new coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, I think I know something that's related with, not directly answer your question, but related with this question, is that China's current policy to improve the energy efficiency is to close down the small and the low efficient one, but to build a very large scale, very new one with large scale. So if you build a new large scale fossil, like maybe power plant, those power plant maybe will work maybe next 30 or maybe even longer. So how to mitigate, how to dealing with such new one, there will be a kind of a challenge actually is kind of a barriers because you improve the energy efficiency, but the new one, more efficient one, they still produce the carbon emission and they produce more and much more than before. So this is kind of a dilemma from the policy side.
Let me just say, sitting to your right, I see Michael Berger from the law school. I should have recognized earlier. Thank you for all your help in organizing this event. Appreciate that. Let's see, right here, and then we'll go here.
Hi, I'm Bill Hewitt. I'm a writer and I teach at the NYU Center for Global Affairs, which is itself something of a competitor to SEPA, not as well established as Fletcher, certainly. My question regards nuclear power. And I think a lot of people believe the myth that there is zero carbon in nuclear power, certainly when it's up and running. But talked about embodied emissions. There are tremendous embodied emissions in the steel, in the cement, et cetera, the processing and the back end as well. So I'm just curious if in China or MIT or anywhere, you're aware of a cost benefit / GHG benefit analysis of nuclear power versus true renewables.
I can just briefly say that, so there has been work done on this issue, not by our group, but by others at MIT. My understanding on this issue is that it really is the use phase emissions that dominate here, because it does take some amount of cement and steel to build these large coal-fired power plants as well. If you compare that to other more distributed types of generation, the story changes slightly and in ways that could be actually decisive. I think I don't have numbers offhand for you, but in terms of what matters for nuclear, the use phase emissions from a coal plant versus a nuclear plant, I think, really dominate the calculation of the construction-related emissions. The same is true for vehicles as well.
Kawaguchi.
My name is Yoriko Kawaguchi. I'm a visiting scholar from Japan at WEAI. I feel that the agreement between the two governments, China and US, is a great accomplishment. And I have two short questions regarding this. One is that it's good that China has agreed to the year to peak out. But real issue is at what level? And so far, China has not said anything about this. Now, are there efforts, now that Xi Jinping is coming, are there efforts on the two governments to work on the level of emissions at the peak? If China is thinking about emissions trading that deals with the absolute amount of emissions, that's my first question. The second is that the importance of this two governments agreement is that now China needs to persuade in a position to persuade other countries, other developing countries, to work toward climate change issues. Now, China has been grouping itself together with countries like Brazil or India. India and Brazil, as far as I know, have not submitted the INDC yet. Now, is China working with other countries, Brazil, India, and other developing countries, to cooperate toward coming to an agreement in Paris? Does that have an intention to do it? Thank you.
Thank you. So topic one is the level of emissions that China will peak at. Does anybody have thoughts on that question?
I can just very briefly say that this is, don't know about governments discussing this. Certainly individually, I think the Chinese government is very interested in what that peak level may be at the national level as well as at other levels of government. But academics and research partners, especially in the context of joint research projects like the one that I lead at MIT, we work very closely with our colleagues at Tsinghua just to think about likely scenarios given investments that need to take place and potential uncertainties in technology and economic growth, what current trends translate into in terms of a future peak in CO2 emissions. So I think this type of offline and direct conversation on these issues is actually an important way that we develop mutual understanding.
Do you want to throw out a number or a range?
So in our research, and I think this is, again, not the final number. I noticed, Liu Ju, you had a very different, or a somewhat different number in your projection. So we, and again, there are counting issues in this as well. Are we talking about just energy-related CO2, all GHGs? So CO2 from energy, as we see it, is likely to peak in the accelerated effort scenario. Again, this is not a crystal ball, but in the sort of 10 to 10.5 BMT range. So that's probably too tight of a band, but that's in our base case scenario. This is what we see.
10 to
potentially on the
10.5
horizon.
gigatons for energy-related emissions only.
Energy-related emissions only,
Right.
10 and a half,
Right.
yeah, 10 and a half.
Kelly and then Julie.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me just say that first. There's a big range in the academic literature on the peaking level. I think I'd like to make 2 points related to this question. The first is that the non-fossil target that accompanied the peaking target imposes some discipline on the level of the peak and also the shape of the peak. So I think we need to be conscious of that. That's a very important complementary target. If they don't achieve the amount of non-fossil energy that they've committed to, it will be very hard for them to achieve the peak at all. And if they overachieve on the non-fossil energy, it's possible you can have a lower peak, or you can change the shape of the peak. And I think it is really important for people to think about this, and Valerie referenced it earlier. If we have a peak, say it's a low peak, but it plateaus for decades, then your total gigatons into the atmosphere are very high. If you have a high peak but then a very sharp reduction after the peak, your Mount Everest, then you can plausibly have fewer gigatons emitted to the atmosphere. So we have to pay attention not only to the level but to the shape. And then on the other major emitters, I have no insight into that personally, whether China is working with these other countries. But I can tell you from my experience in the White House that every engagement that President Obama had with other countries had climate change in the top, at the very top of the agenda. Not every visit resulted in big, flashy announcements, like the joint announcement with China did, but there were a few, and I think they weren't as publicly recognized. But Mexico, for example, committed to an earlier peak. I think it's 2026, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. And to establish an energy policy task force to work on harmonizing energy efficiency and emission standards across multiple sectors. India made a number of commitments while Prime Minister Modi was here, but then after he left and went back to India, he made a huge announcement on solar, which again sort of will have a big impact on emissions given India's heavy reliance on coal. So I think a number of countries are starting to examine seriously how they're going to address this issue with their national circumstances.
We are unfortunately just about out of time. Julio, do you have any final comments on the peaking issue? And then we're going to have to wrap up.
Just I have one quick comment because it's important. I think compare with the question about whether China can peak or what's the level of China can peak. What's the level of the emission China peak? I think one question I want to go forward is what's the way China can peak? Because we have observed the trends that if a country through the developing stage, they can actually relocate their manufacturing to other countries. They can outsourcing their manufacturing. I just saw this microphone is made in China. If it's made in Vietnam, made in Africa, China can reduce its carbon emissions. And other countries, they grows, and the global total emissions still grows. So it's not the peak issue is not just a China's issue. I would suggest that we consider as a global scale and look at what's the footprint. Just as this glass said, to protect our environment, we need to consider our whole footprint. This is what.
That's a big topic that we could do an entire other session on. Very interesting. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everybody that had questions. Please, first, if you want to come accost our speakers afterwards, you can ask them questions then. As I've said, we're going to continue this discussion one floor up at 2:30. please join me in giving a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Do you have to run off? Or are
I
you
do
gonna
have to
stay?
run off.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
I missed all these classes last week because